Hello, welcome to the CU Try Show. We are super happy to have some great panelists today to join our conversation. And just a reminder that the CU Try Show is designed to sort of educate folks about issues of trauma and resiliency, and to continue to elevate these conversations so that we can also know more about it, but also have some action plans for the future. With that being said, views of the views of our guests are their own. And so if they say anything, we want people to have just an open conversation. And it is not reflective of our funders. Just got to put that little picture out there. But I am super happy. One of the things that the trauma working group had created this year was sort of a list of prioritized discussions they wanted us to have on the Try Show and throughout the month. And so this month's focus has been on domestic violence and dating violence. And so we were able to reach out to really great experts on the field to help continue to broaden our understanding of these issues. I know Courage Connections had a phenomenal community meeting, and I'm hoping Elizabeth can talk about that. But we know that there's a connection between all forms of violence, right? Domestic violence, sexual assault, and community violence. And we just want to keep the community sort of involved in this conversation. So let's do introductions. Who would like to go first? Right now, Vickie, you are right next to me on my screen. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, thank you. Thank you for having me today. I really am honored to be a part of this, and I love coming to communities and speaking with folks from the state perspective. My name is Vickie Smith. I'm the president CEO of the Illinois Coalition Against Domestic Violence, of which Courage Connections is one of our members. And we provide a lot of technical assistance and public education and training and advocacy to our membership. So the local programs like Courage Connections that provides the direct services, we support them. And we're located in Springfield, middle of the state capital, but we really are a statewide organization.
Yeah, I think that's people don't know sexual assault has something similar, right? About how collaborative the work is. It's beautiful.
Yeah.
So who would like to go next? Elizabeth, Jaya, or I'm kind of going through my screen.
Sure. And hello, Vickie and Jaya. And Karen, it's so nice to be here. So thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this panel with two other women that I respect so much in their work. And the Illinois Coalition Against Domestic Violence, as Vickie mentioned, is a huge resource and repository of best practices for us as we, as Vickie described, do our work here in the community. So Courage Connection is actually celebrating a milestone. We are in our 50th year. And so we are actually one of the oldest domestic violence programs in the state of Illinois and actually in the nation, which I think really reflects the community that we live in and how when Courage Connection started back in 1971, there were no laws on the books making domestic violence a crime. Also, it was prior to the work of Ruth Bader Ginsburg and many other visionaries that allowed women to be able to have their own credit cards, be able to sign mortgages and leases by themselves. So when you think back just in 50 years, the resources and the tools and the laws that have been put into place to help protect survivors, it's been quite a journey. So at Courage Connection, we provide emergency residential shelter for 45. It's a 45-day program. We provide legal advocacy, counseling for individuals as well as families and children. We provide community education. We also have two bilingual, Spanish speaking, fluent speaking advocates on staff, but we keep trying to come up with a better name than the bilingual program, because it really is a program that's designed to help everyone who speaks English as a second language or is part of our immigrant community. So we really try to make sure that our reach is all inclusive within the community. And we serve approximately 1,200 individuals each year, and through community education, we'll generally reach about 10% of Champaign County. We serve 4 counties, but so in community education, we tend to reach about 30,000 folks in different ways, shapes and forms.
Wow, right? Impressive, right here in our backyard. And I don't think most people realize just how amazing it is that this is sort of the birthplace of women's support centers, which is always just amazing, right? So great. Okay, Jaya, and I know you've got a commercial too. That's right. These are phenomenal organizations.
And it's going to sound a little repetitive, actually.
No.
So my name is Jaya Kolisetty. I'm the Executive Director at Rape Advocacy Counseling and Education Services, or RACES. We're located right here in Urbana, and actually similar to Courage Connection, RACES is celebrating its 50th year. There is actually a lot of overlap between our 2 offices. We've had shared history at time and are close collaborators now. We serve the same 4 counties. Back in 1971, RACES started as a group of women who were organizing, who called themselves the Champaign County Women Against Rape, or CC WAR. We've advanced and changed over time, in part to be more gender inclusive, but we recognize that we do come out of community organizing, and that's something we're really proud of. We do serve the same 4 counties as Courage Connection. We serve Ford, Douglas, and Piatt, as well as Champaign County. And then we also provide a range of services. We provide confidential services to survivors and their non-offending significant others. All of our services are free as well. So that includes therapy services for survivors 3 and older. That includes legal advocacy from our office as well. So where we might be providing a referral over to Courage Connection if it's more dating or domestic violence related. If someone needs help related to sexual violence or stalking, that's kind of our area of expertise, where we can help people navigate the legal system, help get protective orders, things like that. We also do have our 24-hour hotline. So if anybody needs support at any time of day, they can call 217-384-4444. Lots of fours there. And there's somebody who's trained and available to speak confidentially to someone at any time. We also do prevention education. So again, the elementary school, preschool on up, we provide age-appropriate, evidence-informed, trauma-informed prevention education programming, so that we can start these conversations like what we're going to have today with really young students, and then build that network of support for folks over the years. So I hope I didn't forget anything, but like Elizabeth said, we've got a wide range of things to make sure that we're both proactively trying to change the dynamics that we see in our community, thinking about ending sexual violence, right? But then also that we have our support services for all the folks who have been impacted.
Yeah, I mean, amazing resources. I am always surprised, though, and I'm sure you probably encounter this, that there are people who don't know the history, right? It's almost like a hidden network, because if you know, then everybody knows, and then there are all the folks who seem to be outside of the loop. And so I always find that to be fascinating. And so when we get to the end, let's talk about like maybe strategies, if people are listening, to sort of encourage more engagement or sharing or talking, because I think somehow the secrecy around domestic violence and sexual assault sometimes limit the conversations, but I'm not sure. I did want to say one thing before I go into sort of more questions. It seems like your reach has expanded. Like when I came to Champaign, I was affiliated with Rape Crisis Services. And so it seems like, and now I'm like, like, it just seems, is that true? Like the reach is expanding a little bit over time? Is that your awareness that the work continues to grow, or is it that access is decreasing? I'm just not sure.
I think that's a great question. And I would imagine that Elizabeth probably would see the same thing. Is being located in Champaign County, a lot of times that's where the conversations kind of get centered, right? We have an incredibly supportive community here with local funders and with community involvement. But both of our centers have served those other 3 counties for decades, right? But I think a lot of times people do kind of see, oh, well, you're located in Urbana or Champaign, so that must be your service area. But we really are committed, both agencies, to serving folks across a big chunk of East Central Illinois.
Definitely. And I think that interestingly enough, too, we find folks from those counties that we serve will start by coming to Urbana because the other counties that we serve tend to be fairly rural. And so when you are, going for an order of protection or you're seeking help, sometimes you're in a very small town, and sometimes the judge that is hearing the order of protection, he might be or she might be your next door neighbor. It might be even that this person is friends with your abuser. So a lot of times, and although you can, receive an order of protection, from Champaign County, we obviously do serve the other courts, just as Jaya mentioned, in those other more rural counties. But we do tend to see people kind of reaching out here coming from smaller towns because it seems like it is a little bit more anonymous.
Yeah.
So it's not just
Karen, if I could add too, I think it's important. This is part of the mythology around who experiences domestic violence and who commits domestic violence. And we tend to think across the board, violence doesn't happen in rural counties, in rural communities. And it very much does happen everywhere across all socioeconomic strata. And so to Elizabeth's point, sometimes people want to come to a larger city because it's more autonomous, but sometimes they don't want to leave their community either. The opposite is also true. And so being available in different ways in those smaller communities is also very helpful. But we need to keep in mind that this happens everywhere. There are no boundaries to violence, domestic violence, and sexual assault.
Thank you for the clarification. And that access issue, I can imagine, is of both ways. There's some anonymity that could happen in a bigger city, but then if you have transportation barriers or any of those other things, they could serve as really obstacles to care. So I really appreciate the clarification. So what I did want to ask as sort of a first question, and you sort of peppered, opened the conversation, is what do you think are the intersections between community violence, sexual assault, domestic violence? What would you want the larger audience to sort of see how all of those things go together? People haven't been to your 40-hour training.
Sure. I guess because we just hosted a summit that was attended by over 120 folks. So we had a really good turnout, and Jaya was a part of the audience and also a discussion leader. And the summit was sponsored by the Community Coalition, and the Community Coalition here which is a countywide organization, but it pulls together law enforcement officers, educators, folks from different community organizations, from non-for-profits, to elevate the conversation about finding solutions to community violence. And so I think one of the biggest changes in the 2 years that I've been here, but also in talking to staff who have been here for many years longer than that, this summer, sadly, just because there were some incidences of gun violence that were directly related to domestic violence, it really elevated the conversation in our community. And we, Courage Connection, found ourselves with a greater opportunity to talk about how domestic violence is not a woman's issue, it's not an individual issue or a family issue. It's a community health crisis in the same way that gun violence is. And the way that violence has been normalized, whether it's domestic violence or sexual assault or gun violence between individuals. We've seen an uptick in all of that. And so we had 3 amazing nationally recognized speakers, and then we went into at the summit on September 30th, and then we went into an exercise using the World Cafe method. And one of the questions that we asked participants was, now that you've had a chance to think about it as a community, do you think there is a connection between domestic violence and gun violence? And it was an overwhelming yes. And again, I don't know that that would have been the sentiment expressed by communities in the past. And so then we started talking about programs that help to support all of those things, and looking at everything from toxic masculinity, which is associated with gun violence as well, to different prevention programs and different interventions. So sadly, I definitely believe that it's connected, but having the opportunity to be part of that conversation about community violence. And I know that Jaya and I have talked about, because she's a part of that conversation as well. And our organizations probably would have been a little more to the side of that prior to this summer. So I do really commend the community and the coalition for raising up this issue and understanding that this is a part of community violence.
Yeah.
I would like to add too that if we really look at violence across the board, the root causes are the same. We name it and label it different ways. Part of that's because of funding, part of that is because of the responses, part of that is a lack of understanding that those are all from the same place. If folks are experiencing domestic violence in their home, it's going to spill out into the streets. It's going to become, people who have been involved in gun violence are not unfamiliar with family violence. Mm-hmm. And people who are experiencing violence in the street are not unfamiliar with family violence. And if we tie it to things like racism and sexism and homophobia, then it's clear what causes violence in our society and what our responses need to be to address and reduce violence in our society. So I love the idea that the community has come together and begun to recognize, because that's how we really develop solutions and prevention efforts to reduce violence across the board.
Yeah, to get to root causes and not just symptom reduction. Yeah, Jaya, do you have other things to add? Or I'm sure you might have.
I mean, in some ways, I would just echo what's already been shared. I started in this work, other than being a volunteer, as a prevention educator, right? So being one of the folks out in the schools, and we've really, and generally as a field, folks have kind of adopted a public health approach to understanding sexual violence and domestic violence prevention, right? Recognizing that this is a public health crisis, and that the same factors that contribute to other forms of violence, as has already been stated, absolutely contribute to these other forms of violence. So looking at what are the risk factors for folks enacting these forms of harms, right? What are the protective factors that reduce the likeliness of someone enacting these forms of harms? And also really keeping it in mind that that's where our focus needs to be, right? A lot of times when we talk about sexual violence and domestic violence, people think about folks who might be targeted, right? Who might be the victims of harm, rather than saying, well, what's actually causing this? What are the behaviors? What are the factors that might make someone feel like it's okay to do this, or might make somebody more likely to be violent towards another person? So really starting to break that down, of whether that's, a lack of that support from a supportive adult in their life growing up, whether that's exposure to violence at a young age, whether that is toxic masculinities, right? Like the strict adherence to gender norms is actually a major risk factor for all of these different forms of harm. And so actually looking at, like, what does the research tell us? Folks have been doing this really great work for a long time, but there has been a lot of work, especially coming out of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, right? About, like, what is that we need to be addressing to get at these root causes, and also looking at it not only at that individual level, but also looking at it at a relational level, looking at it at a community level and a societal level. So we're addressing prevention at multiple different points as well.
Can I add, because what Jaya, you make some amazing points, and Vickie, you too. It's just an honor to be in this conversation with you, and I agree so much. And so I think too that not only by having a conversation in the community about domestic violence being a public health crisis, not only are we shedding light on the causes of domestic violence and the root causes being the same, but it also helps people to gain a better understanding of gun violence. Because I think that in our community for several years, it's been very easy to say, oh, well, the gun violence that is occurring is gang related. And when we say that, right, like we keep that at arm's length. And the truth of the matter is what's been going on in our community and communities all around the country is that it's interpersonal violence. It's person to person. It's you can see all the signs on Facebook. You can see the conversations before it happens. And so really then there's very little difference between interpersonal gun violence and intimate partner violence, and those root causes are the same. So I think that we gain a better understanding of both issues when we talk about them together.
Yeah, I kind of always wish for everybody to have the anti-oppression training that's embedded into your training, because once you see the work from an anti-oppression lens, you realize that all oppressions are interconnected, and then that whole violent trauma begets violent trauma. So, right, statistically, individuals who are involved in both domestic violence and sexual violence have histories, have etiologies, have either felt oppressed or have systems that reinforce their ability to be oppressive, right? So all of those structural inequalities. So I want to now ask that question around what do you feel like people get wrong about both domestic violence, sexual, what do you think people are missing from this conversation? Because again, I think sometimes we do symptom reduction and not transformation or really think healing, but I'd love to hear your input.
One thing that just stood out to me, if it's okay if I jump in and just what you shared, right, is I think sometimes people have in their head of, someone who commits sexual violence must have experienced it themselves. And I think that it is important to challenge that. When we talk about domestic violence, there are some risk factors associated with growing up in an abusive household, but that doesn't carry through when we're talking about sexual violence. So when we're talking about the impact of various forms of oppression and also privilege, where we see that come into play more with sexual violence is it's about entitlement, right? It's about feeling like someone has the right to ignore someone's consent, to choose to be violent, that other person's ability to say yes or no does not matter. And often it comes with related aspects of dehumanizing folks, right? So especially when we think about the intersection between sexual violence and racism, the ways in which different, especially racialized women's bodies have been dehumanized and seen as not capable of experiencing sexual violence because they have not been seen as fully human. That is a legacy we have to be able to address, and that plays out differently for different racial groups, right? But then also recognizing too that there's a history of playing into misinformation about how sexual violence happens that has contributed to incredible violence against Black men in this country, right? So this specter, this idea of Black men sexually assaulting white women was used as a reason to lynch Black men, right? And so that is part of the history and the legacy that we have to be willing to address as well. Most sexual violence is intra-racial. People of the same race often have a lot of things in common because it's generally someone who is known, someone who is trusted. So there are so many different ways, like we could spend a whole time just talking about myths and stereotypes, but I think getting into that piece about privilege and oppression and intersectionality, I think those are a few things that really stood out when you asked that question.
And I just want to say, and then I'm going to stop talking, but I think I've been thinking a lot about, trauma sort of creates fragmentation. And I think people love to think about those categories that are connected to myths so that they can go, it won't happen to me, or if we do these things, we can be safe and protected, or those are other people's problems, right? Everybody loves the stranger that's going to kind of come out from the book, right? No one wants to think about the uncle or the brother. And so I just think about all of that fragmentation that's connected to that.
Yeah, the just world belief or hypothesis is one that like really has an impact. People want to believe good things happen to good people, bad things happen to bad people. That's something that happens to someone else. And I think it's worth noting that the additional impact of that is sometimes we miss the folks in our communities who are creating these or enacting these forms of harm because they don't fit what people think of like, you could tell by looking at someone. Well, no, you can't. And it could be someone who you really care about. They could be a good person in some ways and also harm someone in another.
Yeah.
And I think in domestic violence, people think it's violence, and it's mostly not.
Mhm.
It's mostly manipulation, coercion, threats, isolation. It's psychological as much as anything. And the physical violence and sexual violence is just used when it's necessary to reinforce the power and control. I would also say that one of the big misunderstandings is we talk a lot about personal responsibility, like we have to be responsible for our own behavior. However, when we think about these big global issues and the societal norms, the last couple of days we've heard a lot about these emails have been flying back and forth between the NFL again. That kind of thing keeps coming up, and it's about privilege, it's about race, and it's about who is worthy in our society and who do I have a right to discount and harm just because of who I am. And I think those are the things that we need to look at. That's an intersectionality as well, right? Mm-hmm. What are the root causes and what are the individual responsibilities and what do people need to learn and understand in order to reduce violence in our society?
Yeah.
So during the summit, when we moved to community discussion, one of the first questions that we asked, building on what Vickie said, was, what did you learn today that surprised you the most? And the answer surprised us, but it didn't surprise us because we know that there's still a lot more education that we need to provide. But the most common answer to that question was that domestic violence was much more than physical violence. And what Vickie's saying, that's absolutely the definition. I mean, domestic violence is about power and control. And so, we see that play out in our programs through financial abuse, which is probably one of the most common. There was a client even coming out of the pandemic who worked in a restaurant and had finally gotten some tips, and she was still living with her abuser, and he never during the entire time with them was ever he physically violent. He took her phone a couple of times and did other things, right? But not what generally you see portrayed in the media. And so she had her first envelope full of tips, and the next morning it was gone. And so when she asked him about it, he said, he gaslighted her and said, well, we all know that you're always misplacing things, so maybe it's in your car, maybe it's someplace else. So, so abusers use whatever tools are available to them. And I think that in a very tragic way, the hour-long traffic stop video from Gabby Petito and Brian Laundrie in Utah, you actually, if you watch the entire video, you have a curtain pulled back on what an abuser at work, because he by the end of that hour is basically fist bumping with the police, and they're taking him to a motel, they're trading travel tips, and as soon as the officer did some great things in terms of separating them, but she's very upset, right? So talk about biases and all of it, and toxic masculinity, which we have seen in law enforcement. As soon as he says, oh, she has trouble with anxiety, like both officers are like, oh man, oh, my ex was like that. Like she was crazy. Like, you don't even want to know. And the other guy's like, yeah, my wife, has a lot of trouble with anxiety. So, I just tell her to take a nice warm shower. And so it's like automatically plays into that bias. And I think that, again, the story is tragic, but we talk a lot in community education about who abusers are and how good they are at doing what they do and hiding themselves. And I think that this is one of the first times that we actually have a recording of someone that, tragically it turned out, was an abuser, and we get to see that, and how abusers, how they can be extremely engaging and look incredibly trustworthy.
And very manipulative.
Yes.
Knew exactly how to manipulate those law enforcement officers.
Yeah.
Which always reminds me that, so this is a tip and strategy, is that we know statistically individuals who have mental health needs or differing abilities have statistically been more vulnerable to all forms of abuse. And in some ways, those vulnerabilities actually, right, are ones that people target, unfortunately, and also ones that the system and structures sort of use against them, right? Because if they present with vulnerabilities, and I wish we had more time to even go through that longer conversation around our own internalized depression, about like what we do about other women, because some women saw, hey, she was vulnerable and being manipulated, and then there were other women who were having separate conversations around her, not acting right. Like, and so I think, we need to continue to elevate these conversations, because if I'm right, like, I just don't think that we have them enough, or with all of the complexities.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So in this moment where there has been a lot of conversations over the past couple of years, around sort of equity and justice, how have those issues shown up in your work? I heard, Jaya, you explicitly said, hey, let's talk about racial history, but I also want to know, in this moment, are there opportunities or unique conversations that you're having that maybe 4 years ago you weren't having?
Yeah. So I think across the nation, our work, our anti-violence work in particular, we're doing a lot of introspective evaluation of who runs these programs and who uses these programs, right? Because it has been traditionally, historically, mostly white, middle-class women who have started up and operated these programs. And generally the services are provided to people mostly poor, people of color, and there's a real disconnect between the people that get the services and the people that organize and provide the services. So the advocacy community, is taking a long, hard look at who we are, how we operate, how we developed, how we need to be different going into the future. And then the other piece of that is, how should we engage with these other activist movements and community organizing efforts to really make our services more available in the community, better understood in the community, and collaborate with the other activists, making sure that folks get what they need in the moment that they need it, and being much more trauma informed about who is sitting in front of us and all of the things that they've experienced, not just the domestic violence incident that brought them to us, or not just the sexual assault event that brought them to us.
Wow. Other thoughts? Yeah, thank you.
I mean, we had some, we have a very diverse staff at Courage Connection, and we had some really raw conversations about race and bias and who we were serving and how we were serving them. And I have never appreciated having team members that are willing to feel safe enough to engage in those conversations and help us all to gain a better understanding. I mean, we know that women of color are more likely to experience domestic violence in their lifetime. And we know that it's more likely that domestic violence will turn lethal. And that's just, but that's not something that we discuss in our community. I think the other group that has really been marginalized and gotten left behind, and I won't go into politics, right? But talking about immigration over the past 4 or 5 years has been so fraught. And so, there were recent years where if we even talked about the free confidential, because all of our services are free and confidential, the services that we were providing to our immigrant community, we would have community members and we would have donors that would basically say that if you are here illegally, that you are not deserving of these services. Because if as a community we're supporting you and we're providing these services, we want you to serve the people of our community. And talk about dehumanizing, and that community is actually one of the most difficult to serve in terms of these, a lot of these survivors are the least likely to have smartphones. We've had clients even recently that didn't even know that they were in Champaign. They came over, they got married, they had been here for maybe 2 years and had children, and they knew they were someplace, in obviously like not New York City, like given the soybean fields and the corn, right? But you really have to go out into those communities and build relationships with also local providers to help those folks feel safe. And one of the speakers at the summit, I thought it was very, very interesting. She put up a photo, 2 photos, one of the way that police officers generally dress and when they would arrive on a domestic call. And then also she juxtaposed that with a photo of DEA officers. And she said, it would be very likely, right, that you would not be able to tell the difference between the two. So I think that conversation as well about, members of our immigrant community, I think is, really needs to play such a big role in this overall conversation.
Yeah.
I think I could probably speak to this one all day too. And I probably have a little bit of a different experience on this too. I am RACE's first executive director who is a person of color. So this is not a conversation that is new to me. Thinking about how these resources often have been framed in ways that were catered towards white women, white, straight, cis women, is something that we have to be willing to take on and address. And I think there are so many ways that impacts us, right? Even going back to our origin stories, right? Like we talked about how our local organizations got it started in the 70s, and that often is the way, especially the rape crisis movement is framed, but that's not the whole history. Black women were organizing for hundreds of years. Indigenous folks were organizing and addressing these issues for so long before there was more of this mainstream kind of what's known as the foundation of these movements. So some of it is even going back and saying, we can't start our history in 1970, right? Like that's actually not where our history starts. We need to recognize the work, the legacy of folks of color that enable these spaces to be created. Not only the methodology, but also the legal cases that go back hundreds of years, right? There's so many different ways that I think a lot of times it is kind of like, oh, this is new epiphany. And for some folks, it might be, right? It might be that those barriers were not as evident. And it's important for us to learn from these moments, but I think it's also important to situate it within our history and recognize this did not come out of the blue. And that it has a real impact, not only on the clients, the folks that we might see, right? Is someone going to feel comfortable coming into our office if no one looks like them, right? No one speaks their language. There's nothing to indicate that they are welcome in that space. But then also thinking about how it impacts our staff. These are fields that tend to have very high turnover. Vicarious trauma is definitely something that is concerning, and burnout. And often what I hear, especially from other folks of color, is it's not necessarily the trauma work, it's the microaggressions, it's the discrimination, it's the dehumanization that they experience from folks who are not people of color, who have authority that drives them out of this work, not only in the community, but I spent the last 2 years on campus, and within campus spaces, so often we see advocates who get pushed out because they are not seen as fitting a certain idea of what is appropriate for that space. So I think it's one that needs to be tackled on all fronts. And like I said, doesn't only impact the folks that we work with, but also the people who are doing the work.
All right, deep conversations and so solutions. So what would you offer? Because I wanted to make sure that we had a conversation about how do we increase people's engagement, access, involvement, and ability to have these conversations, not just about, hey, did you know that you could go to X facility or Y facility, but these larger conversations around what the root causes, but also what really, if we were imagining a world without sexual violence or domestic violence or without violence, how do we get there? And so I asked like a long conversation sentence, but I do want to know, how do we sort of broaden the dialogue and really get people to be having these conversations in meaningful ways, including funders, right? Ideas?
I think, sorry, Elizabeth, if you want to jump in, feel free.
No, I was just going to share that Michelle Jones, who goes by the stage name Feminista Jones, who's amazing, who created the hashtag #YouOkSis. I think that, and there are so many different facets to this conversation, but I'll just for the moment address community engagement. People want to know that they can do something. And so Dr. Michelle Jones has a really interesting bystander model where, a lot of times, first of all, right, people won't engage when they see something going on. But to give people tools, right, so that they understand the dynamics of domestic violence and also understand that if they are witnessing something that you can do something. And so her bystander model is, as opposed to addressing the abuser, which is what you typically see and you'll see played out, in movies and that kind of thing, hey, you can't treat her that way. Dr. Michelle Jones recommends that you go towards the victim, the survivor, and that you connect with that person in that moment and say, are you okay? She's even done things. She had a family that she knew was experiencing domestic violence in an apartment building she lived in. And so she used to go and knock on the door and ask to borrow a cup of sugar. And so that would stop the moment. And then she could talk to the person experiencing the abuse, check in with them, and then hopefully offer resources. But she said one of the things that she learned about people when they are bystanders and interrupting and going towards the abuser is that sometimes then they make the situation even more dangerous and lethal for the person experiencing the abuse, because they're going to, chances are, right, be back in private again. And so once that abuser has been kind of publicly shamed or humiliated, you think about, brain chemistry and what happens, and, the cortisol increases, the adrenaline increases, and that's not a good thing. So I think that, we're very interested in looking at community education from a standpoint of helping people, right, to prevent it in their own lives, but then also helping them with family members and with, even situations that we're putting together right now, training for bartenders and servers for how you can intervene if you see something going on, and then helping them. The next step, right, is helping them to know that there are experts that can help Courage Connection and in races, and that we're here to do that. But I think making, helping people to understand that there's something that we all can do. So this isn't, we don't have to be passive, and we don't have to sit to the side and think, gosh, this is horrible, but there's nothing we can do, because there are interventions.
Yeah. All right. Other thoughts? Thank you.
I think one thing I would add, because absolutely that primary prevention, thinking about how do we give folks the tools to step in and, learn more about healthy relationships, right? Like some of that is thinking about like, how do we change these behaviors before we get into situations where folks are already being hurt. But I think the other thing too, and, to Elizabeth's point actually with that is, yes, reach out to us, have us come talk to your school, your community group. Let's think about building those bridges. But I think then the other thing too is empowering people to be good support people, because I think a lot of times people are so flustered or caught off guard if they've never heard someone disclose before, or if it's someone they care about who's talking to them, that sometimes people unintentionally say things that are really harmful and can really negatively impact people's healing. So thinking about starting from that place of belief, knowing to be there to listen to someone, not be asking questions that sound like you don't believe what happened to them, but really started from that place of, I'm really sorry that happened to you, and I'm here to support you. That in and of itself is huge. And then if as a support person, they're having a hard time, they can reach out too, right? Like nobody has to be the one and only expert, but just starting from that place of compassion and caring and knowing what resources are available can make a world of a difference, even if it's not primary prevention, those secondary, so right after the fact, and then tertiary, so that long term, how do we support people through their healing? Those are forms of prevention too, and they also contribute to creating a safer environment, a safer community.
Love that.
Yeah, a lot of this takes place in the workplace, in school, in places where it's really more visible if we're more aware of what's going on. And if we remember to look for things like the manipulation and the threats and the grooming and those kinds of behaviors, if we educate ourselves about that, and then we can say to the individual, I'm really worried about you. I want you to know that I care about you, and I don't want to see you badly treated. And just opening that door, judgment is such a huge thing, whether it's real or perceived. The judgment on people who experience violence really interferes with their ability to seek assistance or to figure out how to help themselves or help their family members. So if we just keep that door open, as just be empathetic, just say, I really care about you.
Yeah,
It goes a long way.
Right. Guilt and shame are really, strong interrupters of success, like health and wellness and recovery. And I frequently believe that if more people had the capacity to share what their experiences are, because these are things that happen in the dark, right? Like people think, well, it doesn't happen to this person or that person or whatever. But I think the more we come out of the closet and sort of share, the more other people then have space and place to talk about their own lived experience. And there's a quote that is Marianne Williamson frequently uses, and she says, if one woman, and we could generalize that beyond just women, but if one woman told the full truth about her life, the whole world would burst open. And I love that, right? Like, how do we make room for more truth telling? I'm going to ask that question even more broader. So again, in the public discourse, there's been conversations about a world without violence, right? Like sexual violence, particularly it showed up in the abortion debate, right? We're going to end rape so that there's no need for abortions. So but I do think though, the more I thought about it, I was like, it is time to revisit that conversation, because I think when we've, and Vickie, you can tell me, but I think sometimes in the professionalization, we think about systems and support and structures and not dismantling. And so I do wonder, do you ever envision what it would take to have it different? What what's the imagination of how do we get to this something different and not this self-perpetuating system?
I think one of the things you mentioned, Karen, our systems reinforce the bad behaviors, whether it's the medical system, the education system, the criminal justice system, whichever system we've built, it's not for helping people. And that's one of the we're going to have to dismantle our systems. We have to build what's really helpful to people. And, when the whole conversation about defund the police was about figuring out how to better help people. The police should not be our mental health responders. They should not be our family interventionists, right? That's what that means. We want a world where, yes, we need fewer police. We want a world where a lot fewer people think violence is a way to settle issues, whatever that is. And that's about privilege. It's about racism. It's about homophobia and sexism. And until we dismantle those systems that reinforce those oppressions, we're just going to be spinning our wheels and continuing to do this. So, and it has to be done one brick at a time. Okay. And each of us can pick up a brick and haul it away, right? So it does take all of us.
I love that as a metaphor. Each of us has our brick or pebble or stone.
Well, and Vickie had pointed out the emails, that surfaced with the NFL, and I think that that even serves to reinforce her point, right? That we have ways that we can measure progress in the NFL in terms of having it's an absurdly low number, right? But 5 openly gay players, right? And that's kind of like, so without dismantling the system, right? That's kind of how the NFL has said, oh, we're starting to really look at diversity, equity, and inclusion. And instead, right, you have 120 some emails where one of the most influential, broadcasters and coaches is just absolutely, still talking about the system the way that it actually truly exists. And so it is going to be, about, I'm going to go out and get my brick after this, because it is about dismantling those systems completely.
So I think what other folks have shared makes me think of an Audre Lorde quote, and I might get it a little bit wrong, but she talks about that something along the lines of, I will never be free until all women are free, even if her shackles are very different than my own. And I'm paraphrasing, of course, she said it beautifully, but like expanding that out and recognizing, in order to make a difference, we have to challenge all forms of oppression, right? We can't live in our, I know it's funny because in our little Zoom boxes that we're all in our little boxes, yeah. But really making those connections. And that's one of the things I loved about the summit that Courage Connection hosted, was it was a space to say, yes, domestic violence is a problem in our community, and also gun violence is a problem in our community, and both are connected, and we have to be willing to address both if we're going to make a difference. So I think some of it is recognizing those those connections and being willing not just to do our one little piece, but recognizing that means we have to have those conversations of how these are all connected. But I think the other thing that, makes me hopeful and feels like we're actually working towards something is thinking about prevention, right? Like I said, I started as a prevention educator. I truly believe we make a difference. So having those conversations about what is healthy, right? What's not healthy? What are your boundaries? You have a right to have your boundaries respected, whether you're 2 or whether you're 90, right? And so having those conversations across the lifespan, helping people figure out, how do we help someone who maybe is, has been hurt, or maybe is potentially doing something harmful, right? Like that's a positive intervention if we are helping someone who has those maybe not so good things that are happening or they're enacting as well, that all of those pieces are really important, and they do contribute to making that change. And I think another piece of it too is talking about, when we talk about what's healthy, not just what's healthy in terms of relationships, but also what's healthy in terms of sex and sexuality, right? Like having a society that is so shameful around sex contributes to people thinking that sex should hurt, which it shouldn't, right? Contributes to people feeling like they can't talk about it if they've experienced sexual violence because it's conflated with being sexually active rather, which there's still a lot of shame for folks around. So I think really broadening what we mean by having full and healthy lives to really support people being able to express their full selves, to feel supported, believed, and be able to decide like, yeah, this feels good to me. This feels right for me. Or no, I don't like those things, right? I want to be able to set that boundary. So having that conversation across the lifespan really can make a difference.
Oh,
You know, those conversations are not easy. Engage with somebody about spanking. And it is so emotional and so difficult. My parents spanked me and I turned out just fine. It's like, well, let's talk about that, right? Those are the kinds of things that we continue to cling to in society without really thinking and talking about them. And it's exactly what you said. We're going to have, that's the brick, right? You have to keep having these conversations in person together across whatever network you engage with. And what does that really mean? If it's okay to spank, what does that really mean? If it's okay to be in control if you're a man, what does that really mean? You know, we just have to keep having these conversations until it begins to permeate our society to a point where most of us understand violence is not just violence. Yeah. Right? It's really all of these other behaviors that reinforce the use of violence.
Yeah, the whole time I wanted to clarify, for me, when I think about violence, I think about impact, not behavior. So I think about violence being anything that causes you pain and reinforces feelings of powerlessness. So that could be verbal, financial. So violence is the impact, not the act, right? And so when I think about structural violence or anything, right, it is the effect of it, not the punch. And so maybe that's a broadening of the frame. We have spent almost a whole hour together, and I would love if you've got any closing comments to offer. It's been a wonderful conversation, but I want to give you like your final go round in terms of what you might want to offer.
I'd just like to say thank you, and it's been so wonderful to be a part of this conversation and knowing that there are so many fantastic people like the ones that we've been talking to, all three of you today, right? Like that gives me a lot of hope. And I didn't get a chance to give our phone number. We also have a 24/7 hotline that is answered locally here, just like Races. And the number is 217-384-4390. And
it's a wonderful resource. Yeah. And everybody should just put it in your phone, right? Because you just never know when you have a friend or family member who might need it.
Yeah. I would like to say thank you. I really appreciate this opportunity to talk. I want to say to your audience, get informed and get engaged. And I also want to leave a statewide hotline number. So no matter where your audience is, they'll have it. It's 877-863-6338.
Love that. Get informed and get engaged. Okay.
I would just echo the words of thanks. I know we're getting low here on time, but having these conversations, and I think breaking down the silence around these topics is really important. So I encourage folks to, keep talking about it, keep thinking about it, have those conversations with folks in your life, and then do reach out for support as you need it, whether it's a question, whether it's maybe that is something I need to talk to somebody about, whatever it might be. We want folks to know they're not alone, right? That's one of the big things too. For survivors in our community, you have people who care about you, who are here to support you, listen to you, believe you, whether it's calling Courage Connection or again, Races hotline is 217-384-4444. And we're available 24 hours a day. And this is an incredible community that can make a difference together.
Thank you so much. And also want to remind you, amazing not-for-profits, Courage Connection and Races. And so they are always looking for volunteers and support. They are local, homegrown. And so there are always so many needs that funding doesn't cover. And so just to think about and then they serve families and individuals. There is no discrimination. We've talked a lot about women, but they serve a broad tent. And so I just want you to see them as this incredible resource that we are so fortunate to have in our community. Thank you so much and be well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.